let's get started here. Welcome, everyone. This is MarshWatch 10, the last episode in the series, and I'm hoping that, if you've been able to take in the whole series so far, whether that's virtually or listening to the recordings online, I'm hoping that you're feeling like this little mallard duckling who just looks like it is ready to take on the big wide world. So hopefully you're feeling that way about marsh birds more and more in your area. I would just like to say that I am broadcasting today again from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, which encompasses the traditional lands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Saulteaux, and Stoney First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. And it's where I've been fortunate enough to call home for a little over 10 years now. I guess 11 or so. My name, of course, is Leanne Latremoy, and I have the utmost pleasure of working for an organization called Birds Canada. We're a national not-for-profit, and our mission is to drive action to increase the understanding, appreciation, and conservation of birds in Canada. And hopefully, through some of the programming that we do like this, that we're hitting a few of those nails right on the head. I, of course, am mildly obsessed with wetlands. They are my happy place. Even when the mosquitoes are buzzing, they're still pretty wonderful locations. So it is an area that definitely requires a full layer of clothing, no matter the season, because gosh, those mosquitoes, they can really get after you. So on the agenda for this evening, we'll just do a quick recap of why wetlands are important to kind of wrap the whole series up. We'll get to the amphibian review, which we didn't get to do last week because after 2 hours we had only covered the birds. So I decided to cut the amphibians out, and we'll have them today. We'll also go over a little bit of our wetland plants. We'll do some wetland soundscapes, and full disclosure, I did not have the chance to update these slides. It's just been a bit of a hectic couple of weeks here. So these will be the same soundscapes that you heard last year. We do have a few different ones online on the YouTube channel if you want to go and check those out as well. We'll also go over how to collect a checklist, and then I will just give you some rundowns for MarshWatch by the numbers, and then we can turn off the recording and chit chat, and you can ask me all of your burning questions about birds that you haven't had a chance to ask yet. Okay, so let's go get started. What is a wetland? Wetlands are defined as land that is saturated with water long enough to promote wetland or aquatic processes indicated by poorly drained soils, vegetation, and other biological activity that's adapted to a wet environment. That's kind of the technical definition. That comes from the National Wetlands Working Group in the 1997 publication. But really, they're transition habitats. They're not quite totally water and they're not totally upland, and they can transition between those two states depending on how full the basin is. And sometimes that basin, goes from wet to dry on an annual basis. Some of the larger basins tend to hold water for many years in a row, and it's only in, 1 out of every 5 years or 1 out of every 10 years where that basin dries up completely. And it's still part of the wetland process, especially here on the Northern Great Plains, as I was alluding to when folks were coming on in. We go through a lot of dynamic wet-dry cycles here on the prairies, and thus so do our wetlands. So they expand when there's more water on the landscape, and they contract when there's less water on the landscape. And all of that helps to promote a renewal process in the wetland. These habitats are adapted to that cycle, whether, again, if that happens on an annual basis or, on a much more infrequent basis. They are landscapes really characterized by change and water. Because of that behavior on the prairies, there's been a whole classification system developed for the prairie pothole wetlands. This was written up by Stewart and Cantrud in 1971, and it basically defines these wetlands on the deepest portion of them. And like this little diagram shows, you have different classes of wetlands based on that sort of water permanence. So there's ephemeral wetlands, temporary, seasonal, semi-permanent, and permanent. Some of those ephemeral wetlands, we wouldn't necessarily think of those as wetlands, but they're the ones that, are low spots on the prairies, or, if the field has been tilled up, you'll see them in the springtime. They're the places that hold water. But even, in their native state, if they say they haven't been tilled, they're only going to be holding water for a short portion of the year. Usually that's the spring runoff, and before the frost plug melts in the earth, they will hold a little bit of water. And so they're just kind of wetter places in a field. They're not what you would normally think of as a classic wetland environment, but they are still considered wetlands, and they do collect water on those little basins. So it's everything from those kind of just shallow depressions all the way up to, a large permanent body of water that has wetland habitat around the margins of it. So fairly dynamic, and again, that water level can shift within them. And of course, we are, talking about the Northern Great Plains here. And if you live here, you can see this. This might look familiar as if you've taken, a flight in or out of the Northern Great Plains, especially in the wet portion of that cycle. We have an abundance of small, shallow, disconnected wetlands, and that really characterizes the landscape here. So why on earth do we have these? Well, if you remember from the first webinar, it has to do with the last ice age, and more specifically, the meltdown of that last ice age. So 10,000 years ago, during the last glacial recession, that's when the large glacial sheets were retreating. They didn't do that in a nice, neat, orderly fashion. They're messy, and especially because as the glaciers are growing, they're grinding up all kinds of bedrock, and there's just all kinds of things going on. So it's not a nice, clean, orderly recession. It happens in fits and spurts, and sometimes there's large chunks of ice that kind of get disconnected, and then they sit there in the water or on the land even while there's more water building around them, and you get these little depressions. So we get all this knob and kettle topography that we see in this lovely photo here. So you can see all these little mounds and those depressions in them. A lot of those were formed by chunks of ice that just were left and melted out a little bit more slowly than the surrounding landscape. So neat habitat. I invite you to go just even look on, Google Earth, or I guess Google Maps does it now if you do the satellite view, and just take a tour and go see some of those areas. You can really see sometimes the directionality of where the glaciers or where the recession was happening and how it happened, because you can see in some areas these nice orderly parallel areas of knob and kettle topography. Really fascinating. If you're a nerd like me, go take a look. It's pretty cool. So why are wetlands important? They actually do a whole lot on the landscape. And a big part of that is essentially acting like a sponge. They do this by absorbing floodwater, recharging that groundwater, they sequester carbon, and they purify the water. So a lot of that wetland, call it soil, but it's if you've ever walked around in a wetland and gotten up in there, there's all kinds of slowly decaying plant matter, and it takes a really, really long time to break down, and some of that never fully breaks down. I remember in a geography class in university, we went digging in an area that had many, 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 many years ago formerly had a wetland in it, and you could get down to see where the soil was really, really black, and you could actually pick out bits of wetland vegetation that were still in the soil. It was really super fascinating. So all of that kind of organic material really does act like a sponge. So it's able to absorb water and swell to accommodate that water. And then it releases it slowly back into the surrounding landscape. So they're really helpful in flood mitigation on the landscape writ large. All of that fallen plant material every season also holds a lot of carbon in it because it's in an anaerobic environment at the very, very bottom of that wetland. It decays rather slowly or barely at all. So they're really neat for water purification, water retention, and water recharge. They also prevent shoreline erosion. So if you have an area around a lake that has all kinds of wetland plants that are coming, out of that soily area, they reduce the wave action from wind or water boats, anything kind of like that that would be causing waves to crash up on shore. All of that wave action will get mitigated and absorbed a little bit by that wetland vegetation. So, if you ever at a beach and someone's complaining about, ugh, look at that, wetland over on that side, yuck, why don't they do something about it? Well, you could bring up like, well, I'd be losing all that shoreline if there wasn't any wetland plants there. Um, Wetlands, of course, also provide food and essential habitat for animals, which has been largely the focus of this webinar, but that also provide food and resources for humans, wild rice, cranberries in some of the, boggy areas in the forest, fish, game, and plant roots, of course. They also really connect the landscape, and a lot of aquatic insects go on to feed not only wetland birds, but other species, and they actually have connections with other bodies of water when you have migrations of some aquatic insects between little ponds and larger lake or river systems. So they're very connected places and they produce massive, massive amounts of food. Soon you'll be seeing this. As you're driving along, you'll just see these columns, and it almost looks like a column of smoke, but they're these massive columns of midges, and they are hatching out of wetlands, and they just provide a massive amount of food for all kinds of critters that you wouldn't think necessarily. You wouldn't imagine a mallard duckling going after a little midge or even something as big as a Franklin skull. So wetlands are super important. They connect us, the environment, and animals all together, and they're neat habitats. I like them especially for learning bird identification because a lot of the species, as we've covered, they can be flashy, they can be unique, and of course, there's species that look similar to one another, but oftentimes there's enough differences, or if you're listening to the songs and the calls, there's enough differences there too to be able to piece them apart. So I really like them for learning, and this is part of why we selected wetlands for a program like this, because they really make excellent learning opportunities. If you were to do something like this, to learn your birds and go do it in, say, the eastern forests for warblers, then you're going to have a much harder time. They're a much more challenging group of species to see and then discern apart by ear. So I think we're really fortunate here to just have an abundance of wetlands that we can go out and visit. If you're not from here, you can just drive around the countryside and there are wetlands all over the place. So you can just drive down a road and, stop alongside and just stand there from the roadside and, listen to this wetland early in the morning or even in the evening. Just go absolutely nuts. We're super fortunate here. So that's why I like wetlands. And that's why we developed MarshWatch. So MarshWatch, of course, the introductory program, we've done all of these webinars, we will do some guided walks. And fundamentally, it's about learning. And I'm realizing, I remember about 20 minutes before doing this, that a friend of mine, John Patterson, had a really good slide for talking about the stages of learning. And he was doing this in a birdsong context, but it works for pretty much everything, and especially for IDing a large group of anything, but we'll call them just the wetland birds here. So you have a few stages of learning. If you want to imagine them being three separate buckets. That first bucket is the unknowns. You have no idea what that bird is. You have no idea what that call is. Then you start off with, well, if you've never done this before, that unknown bucket is going to be pretty full. You also have a familiar bucket where, things are starting to, okay, that looks like a duck. That's sort of familiar, or that sound, vaguely familiar. And so when you're starting out, even the things in the familiar bucket are, you're not going to have a ton of them. And you might only be able to identify a few of them coming into something like this. You may go like, yes, I know mallards. And then maybe that's where your, bird ID finishes at the start of a process like this. And when you're learning anything really, you're taking that unknown and you're trying to get it into the realm of the familiar. And so even just taking something where I've never heard this before, I've never seen this before, even making that leap to going, I've heard that before, or I've seen that before. That is a huge step in that learning process. It takes it from the completely unknown, completely unrecognizable to the bucket of, I have seen or heard this before. It is not totally foreign to me. And stuff needs to transition into that familiar bucket before you can identify it. So eventually you're going to have a whole bunch of things where you're familiar about them, and eventually you'll be able to identify some of them, and you'll be able to be able to identify more and more of them as time goes by. So if you're listening or you're looking, that's that transition from that unknown to familiar. And then to transition from familiar to identified, that's your association, that's your memorizing going, okay, I know the duck with the spur on its side, that's a dabbling duck. I know that's a green-winged teal. And so you're remembering those key features and you're putting names to them. And so eventually that unknown bucket decreases and the familiar and the identified buckets, they increase to hopefully eventually you're going to have more identified species than unknown or familiar. And these buckets are a little bit impermanent. And every spring, I don't know of anybody that this doesn't happen to, when the birds come back, at least, here in the north where most of them are gone for the winter, when the birds come back, you're going, oh my goodness, that sound is familiar. I should know this. It's amazing how much can just go back into that familiar bucket for a little bit as your brain goes, okay, yeah, no, 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 we're just going to remake those associations. Yep. That is a Sora calling. Maybe that's a bad one because that one's pretty pretty easy to remember. But something like a Junco that maybe, you see for a short time on migration and, comes back in the spring and all of these spring birds are going. So it's a dynamic process and there is something that happens, and I've mentioned this before, when you're learning a whole pile of stuff and call it birds. You'll get to a point where you're like, yeah, feeling really, really good. I've identified a ton of it. And then for whatever reason, you'll go through a period where everything is going back into the familiar bucket and some things are going back into the unknown bucket. This happens, and this is a point where you should just go, okay, I'm just going to give it a rest for a day or two, sleep on it, and then your brain reorganizes that information and it remakes those associations. So don't worry if you find yourself going back and forth between these buckets of unknowns, familiars, and identifieds. We all do, and it's part of the learning process, and sometimes that learning process happens on an annual basis as you refamiliarize yourself. So that's kind of the stages of learning, especially as it relates to birds. And you might be feeling some of this because we went through a whole lot of species. So last week we covered all of the 51 bird species that we introduced throughout the program. And I just want to be clear that this is by no means an extensive or completely exhaustive list of birds that you might see using a wetland. These are some of the core species that in the northern Great Plains you're likely to see, but this doesn't include everything. There's all kinds of other birds that come and visit wetlands, especially the migratory ones who are going on to places further north. We haven't really covered, hardly any of those. So this is just kind of the starter pack of the prairie wetlands. So hopefully you can take this knowledge and apply it to a different unknown bird. Because that's some of the thing. It's like you get to be familiar with a lot of the species you're seeing, and then that lets you point out, hey, that one's different. That one I don't recognize. And that already narrows it down because you'll have a larger group of species that you feel comfortable or confident with. So just to say, this isn't an exhaustive list. We could be here, maybe not all year, but we would be here much, much longer if we covered every single species that you could ever find in a wetland. What we didn't finish covering, though, was the frogs and toads. So we covered 10 amphibians, and let's get to them right now. So two of our first frogs, we've got the boreal chorus frog and the wood frog. The boreal chorus frog, I have a hard time finding these little guys. So this is one that you'll mostly hear. If you do get to see it, they have a nice little dark eye line that extends through the eye down the side of the body. And these are pretty small little frogs. And the call really sounds like running your fingernails over the teeth of a comb. So let's listen to that reek. Reek. And if you're going out right now, especially here in Canada, like you're likely to be hearing boreal chorus frogs going because this is the time of year. The wood frog is slightly larger, and this is one that I find I run into a little bit more often compared to the chorus frog. So the distinguishing feature here, they do have a little line that extends from the snout to the eye, but it ends in a great big dark kind of chestnut colored wedge behind the eye. They have various little spots along the sides of their body, but really it's that big chunk behind the eye, that wedge right behind the eye, that really, for me, is the thing that stands out when I see them. Unlike the boreal chorus frog, where it's, there's dark leading from the snout all the way through the eye and then down the sides of the body. The wood frog has that little wedge behind the eye. And they sound sort of funny. They sound kind of like they have it sounds like a harsh quacking noise. So some people like to call these the duck frogs. All right, let's listen to that once more. Okay, next we have the northern leopard frog and the spring peeper. The northern leopard frog is a fairly largish frog, and it is so named because of the leopard-like spots that they have on their body. Like most frogs, the coloration, like the background coloration, is quite variable, but they will all have these spots that have these little kind of halos around the sides of them. So leopard frog with the halo, and it makes a really kind of throaty sound, kind of like balloons rubbing together. So weird kind of throaty noises. Spring peepers, on the other hand, they have a very high-pitched and very loud peeping noise. These guys are tiny. You're unlikely to see them in part because they are so small, and they tend to be arboreal, so they like to hang out on leaves, in trees, on shrubs. But if you do see them, they have a nice little X right across their back. You can see that nice little X there. But you're much more likely to hear them, and they are quite loud, especially when you have a lot of them going together. I kind of miss that sound. We don't really have them here in Saskatchewan. You'll get them a little bit in Manitoba. There was a couple of records during the breeding bird atlas years up in the boreal forest of them, right along the Manitoba or right near the Manitoba border. But you definitely have them across eastern Canada, more so. Okay, next up we have the tree frogs, which essentially look identical to one another, and they're separated into two different species because they have differences in the number of chromosome pairs that they have. So the gray tree frog has more of a whirring call. You can sort of hear the pulses in that whir. And these are also quite loud, and they can be tough to see because, much like the spring peepers, they are arboreal, so they like to hang out in leaves, on trees, in shrubs and things like that. And sometimes you'll see them climbing screens or sidings of buildings. They're really cute. They have those enlarged toe pads, which are really good for gripping. And otherwise, they kind of just look very blobby. They don't, they just kind of scrunch up, and they just kind of look like a loaf of sorts. The Cope's gray tree frog has more of a buzzy call, and you can't really make out those individual notes. So those are the two tree frogs, gray tree frog and Cope's gray tree frog. This is another one that you'll get in Manitoba, and we don't have them further west than that. Okay, next up we have the two toads. We have the Canadian toad and the American toad. At first blush, they look really similar to one another, so kind of a large blobby toad that you'll see bouncing around out during the day. The thing to look at here that I think is going to be most reliable if you're seeing them up close is the cranial crests. So they have these parotid glands along the side, that's not what we're talking about here. We've got these ridges that run either kind of between the eyes or around the eyes. So in the Canadian toad, the cranial crests connect. And in the American toad, the cranial crests make a little V along the side of the eye. So they connect for the Canadian toad. And the Americans they avoid. I, I'm always trying to come up with little memorization things like that because oftentimes something like this, I know that there's a difference between the two, and I'll just make sure to note it. And then I have to go look at my reference material later because there's only so much information that can live in your head. So if you're doing something like that, you're still doing it. You're doing a great job. Just sometimes there's an overload of information. They both have very long, loud, monotone trills, longer than the tree frogs, and it can be very, very long in the American toad. So let's listen to the Canadian toad first. And we'll give a listen to the American toad. So very long, very loud, very monotone sounding trills. The plain spadefoot and the Great Plains toads are two species that you're mostly unlikely to see unless you happen to be out on the prairies when it's pretty wet out and you are walking around with a headlamp at night. They're both kind of nocturnal and they're fossorial, meaning that they spend most of their time underground and they will come out during periods of wetness. So like these last little bits here. If we were to have that further south, you might have some luck getting them. So, um, plain spadefoot has very big eyes with cat eye pupil slits and little teeny tiny red warts, and they make a very wonderful noise. And the Great Plains toad has just another strange call, and it sounds like you're going. That thing has no name. It should have a name. A very warbling trill. It almost sounds robotic. It doesn't really sound like it's coming from an animal. Okay, so those are our amphibians for review. We're also going to talk about a few of the common wetland plants that we covered. So these are plants that are obviously adapted to that wet environment, and they're tolerant to flooding to varying degrees, but also drying to varying degrees. Some of the cattails and things can tolerate, both a little bit of wetness and a little bit of dryness. They don't necessarily keel over as soon as there's a wet year, but if you have many successive wet years, then that cattail stand is going to be a little bit hard up. So let's start with the cattail. These guys look like essentially, their flower looks like a corn dog on a stick. The previous season's flowers are going to be very, very fluffy, and that's what you're going to be seeing out in the environment right now here on the Northern Great Plains because the growing season is kind of just finally getting underway. They're tall, they have flattened leaves, and they're bright green, and they have many leaves growing from the base of the plant. You'll find them in deep or shallow water, and they can form really, really large floating mats, and they're often in these kind of dense monoculture stands. Now, there is a native species, there's an invasive species, and there's a very successful hybrid species of the two. In the native species, what you're going to be looking for is if you have the flower, you're going to see both the female and the male parts connected to one another. So they're not there isn't a little gap there. On the invasive species, there is quite a gap between the male and the female parts. And on the hybrid one, it's kind of a hybrid between the two, so it's a smaller gap. The invasive cattail, the Typha angustifolia, they're really quite tall. So if you're seeing a whole sea of cattails, and then suddenly there's a clump that's just 2 or 3 feet taller than the rest of them, and I have seen something like that, that's likely to either be your invasive or your hybrid. So the hybrid is also going to be fairly tall. So if you see something like that, that's a good indication. And again, that's that kind of noticing like what doesn't belong, what is different in this sea of things that are kind of more familiar, what stands out as slightly different, and both the invasive and the hybrid are going to look a fair bit taller. The invasive one does have narrower leaves, and again, the hybrid is kind of in between the two, and it can be sometimes really tough to tell unless you're doing genetic testing, which, it's not the age of Star Trek when we just scan stuff and like, oh, get our answers immediately. So we still are a ways out from that, and we have to use our knowledge to the best of our abilities. We also have bulrushes. These are another species that likes to live in deep water and will also form some large monoculture stands. Their leaves are kind of just one single stem, and they are round. They tend to be darker green. So if you're just scanning kind of the wetland habitat, they're going to be a much deeper, richer greens than say the more pale cattails. They have a really neat spongy center. So I invite you to, next time you're out and you see a big bulrush, maybe, don't do this in a park or anything, but take one apart and just take a look at that kind of neat spongy structure on the inside. I find they're really, really fascinating. And they have their flowers in a tassel near the tip of the leaf. We also have common reed. So there is a native species and an invasive species, and we'll take a look at the two here in a second. But generally, for both of them, they are a true grass. They're bright green when they're fresh, and then they turn kind of papery, sandy colored when they're kind of senescing. The flowers form these feathery bits at the top of the stalk. You'll find them in wetlands. They often colonize ditches. They're salt tolerant, especially the invasive species, and they too will form large monoculture stands. I find that's more true for the invasive species. Whenever I've seen the native one here, there isn't usually a ton of it. The invasive one is the one that will take over and form these incredibly dense, really, really tall stands of Phragmites. They're they're pretty neat looking, but they really do choke out a lot of the native vegetation. There are ways to tell them apart. The easiest way is in the fall, which is not this time of year, when the stems of the native species, they will turn a bit more kind of reddish purpley, whereas the invasive ones, they just kind of stay senescing green color, kind of straw-like. There are other, more sophisticated ways if you're able to take a look at the flower parts or the parts where the grass blades kind of fork off of that central stem. If you're able to do that with a hand lens, there are ways to tell them apart, but for the most part, this is kind of beyond the introductory wetland plants that we're doing. So here's just a picture of what that native species looks like in the fall, and you can see that nice kind of reddish purpley stem. Okay, we also have duckweeds, and true to form, ducks really do enjoy eating them. They're full of good nutrients for them. These are tiny, tiny plants. They have 2 to 3 leaves. They float and they dangle their little roots. There's a few different species. This is Lemna minor, the nice little typical duckweed, but we also have ones that kind of fork off and have more of a three-pronged look to them. You'll often find them in still water, so they're not going to be in these larger lake systems. They'll be kind of in those sheltered backwaters, because you can imagine if you're a floating little plant, waves are not going to be your friend. So you'll find these in kind of smaller, stagnant, maybe not stagnant's not quite the right word, but where there's not a lot of wave action, where they can actually live out their happy little plant lives floating on the surface. Sedges are very similar to grasses, but the way to remember them are sedges have edges. So if you were to go and see this, you're like, oh, this is sort of like a grass-like plant. They almost have serrations on their leaves, and their leaves are kind of 3D in cross-section. They would be if you took a cross section, it would look kind of like a little W. So they're firm, they have ridges, they have a triangular stem, and you'll find them in shallow water to wet meadow areas. They form cute little spikelets where they have a little nutlet on the inside of them, so it's a little puffy sac. But just remember, sedges have edges, and rushes are round. Rushes are dark green, they're round, they're wiry, they're a single spiked stalk, and rushes are generally shorter than, say, bulrushes, which were really, really large and round. Ru- Rushes, the juncus species, are short and they're not really spongy on the inside. They're just kind of round and wiry, and you'll often find these more in kind of moist soil areas or those ephemeral wetlands. If you're ever driving around and you see a patch of just, it looks like the rest of the grass, but it's quite a bit darker and richer green. Those are rushes along the side, and that's kind of my favorite thing to, do as a passenger is like, ooh, spot the spot the darker patches in the ditches. You have to be kind of weird to like these wetland things sometimes. So that is me. Okay, so they resemble small bulrushes and they are round in cross sections. And if you do get them flowering, they have actually quite beautiful, intricate little flowers. So take a peek if you ever see them at the peak of their flowering season. They're handsome little flowers. There's also something called a little spike rush. These are dark green. They're round. There is one species, I think, that's kind of square in cross section, but most of them are round. And they have a single spiked stalk where the flower is really like a spear. It forms like kind of that spearhead on the edge. The on the tip of that blade. So you'll find these in shallow water to wet meadow areas. There's also the invasive flowering rush. Really, really beautiful. There is some locations on the South Saskatchewan River getting into the province where we have them here in Saskatchewan. It's more of a problem, I believe, in Alberta, and Ontario as well has a few of these invasive flowering rushes. Purple loosestrife is a well-known invasive wetland plant. We have it here in Saskatoon. I've seen it even, along the river edges and some of the gravel bars. So has bright purple flowers in spikes, square stems with paired leaves, which kind of remind you a little bit of mints. If you're a gardener and you have mint in your garden, that structure is kind of similar with the square stems and paired leaves at right angles. So that is the invasive purple loosestrife there. And there's just a close-up of that kind of triangularish stem. There's also water hyacinth, less of a problem here, but in other places it can be really invasive if there isn't enough winter kill. They do sell this still at gardening stores because they're quite beautiful, which is how most things become invasive. People are like, "Ooh, I love this beautiful plant. I would like to have this," and then they escape into the environment. So, water hyacinth can really, in areas where it takes over, it can really, really change a water body by creating just a thick, dense mat that just completely covers a system and chokes out, everything that would be relying on sunlight, oxygen, all those good things. So invasive species. If you are interested in collecting plant information, I'm going to invite you to share that sort of information with iNaturalist. iNaturalist is a really, really fantastic place, especially I use it all the time for insects and plants. I do take the odd bird photograph sometimes, and I do throw those up there. eBird's usually the best place for collecting bird information, or of course, our own Nature Counts platform. But if you have interesting insect observations, plant observations, especially some of those invasive species, I'd recommend signing up for iNaturalist and using that. It's simple. Record observations, share, people help corroborate your ID. So even if you're just using the AI to say like, oh, this looks like it's a such and such, people do go and review and say, no, actually it's this because that. And then other people help identify it. So it is corroborated with other experts or knowledgeable people to make sure you've got the right identification. So it's neat. It helps you learn that way. So it's a good plug for iNaturalist. I quite enjoy it. At a distance, all of these wetland plants, it can be useful for looking at their basic coloration, because when you're out birding with other people, it's really helpful to say, over by the cattails, or can use a clock face. Oh, okay. At our 1 o'clock, there's, a bird in that tree sort of thing. So these are what the cattails look like at a distance, and you can see in this photo, this is early in the season where you can see last year's flower stalks. They're just, poofy at this stage. So those are the lighter looking cattails. And to the left of the photograph here, you can see all of that much, much richer dark green. Those are all bulrush stands. And then down here in the corner, we can actually see some sedges growing. They're similar looking to the cattails at a distance, but they're going to be much smaller. And, you're not going to usually have an extensive flat of them if you're in a deeper wetland. This just indicates that there is a bit of a shallow area there. Okay. Now we're going to get through some of the soundscapes, and I apologize in advance. These are the same ones that we showed last year. For next year, I do have plans to make more soundscapes and include new different ones as we get more and more wetland recordings. So we're just going to do a few listening exercises. And what we're going to do for the first few here is we're just going to listen through to the soundscape. And in the second one, I'll have prompts where there's going to be a flash of the species that is making that call. So have a listen and see if you can put anything into that, familiar bucket or identified bucket. And hopefully you don't have too many unknowns in this bucket. So let's listen to this first one. It's just about 25 seconds long. Okay. So this is near Foam Lake, Saskatchewan, over 10 years ago now, at 1 o'clock in the morning, and just listen to how alive this wetland is. So hopefully your speakers were good enough to hear a good number of those. I know some of them were quite loud and at the forefront, but let's go and do that again with some of the prompts. So hopefully you heard a few species that are familiar or you could identify it. But let's listen with the prompts. If you have really good ears, you could also tell that maybe there was a sora at the end of that, but these are kind of the louder, more obvious species of the two. If we have enough time, we'll go through that one again. Okay, wetland soundscape 2, same area, 4 o'clock in the morning. This is going to be a little bit noisier, and part of listening to a soundscape like this and actually getting out there and listening to it is there's going to be a lot going on all at the same time. So it takes a bit for your brain to learn to listen, catalog some things, and then listen through those things that you've already cataloged, especially if it's a really abundant species. Like if you have a lot of red-winged blackbirds, that it takes practice to mentally catalog them, just say, yep, there's all of those, they're making those noises, and then you have to learn to kind of ignore them and listen through them, and that just takes practice. It's not something that's necessarily easy to do all at once. It's like having a conversation in a really, really loud room where, it's tough. And if somebody's speaking to you and maybe, in a language that less well, you're going to have a harder time picking out those words. So let's listen to this 4 a.m. soundscape here. So a little bit more going on there than the previous recording, and it can be a lot all at once. And indeed, those 4 a.m. mornings, they can be a little intense. Let's listen to it with those prompts, and hopefully you can pick out more if you weren't able to pick out a ton that first go around. And so even that wasn't cataloging every single thing that was calling. One of the noticeable ones, if you're able to hear it, was the American bittern, that I didn't include in that. But that kind of gives you an example of, okay, you're listening to that soundscape and you're cataloging a few of the species. And once you know, okay, yep, that sedge-wren, he just keeps going regularly. He's hanging out maybe to my right or to my left. And once your brain catalogs it, you can then listen to the bigger soundscape around. Let's listen to that one more time with the prompts. So quite a busy morning, a lot going on in that one. Okay, here is another 4 a.m. one, this time May 25th. I forgot how much I enjoy that track. It kills me every time the Soras, like you get one or two going, and then that gets their neighbors going, which gets their neighbors going, and next thing you know, you've got Soras just going a little bit nuts. So I do love that one. So let's take a listen now with a few of the prompts to get through a little bit of the chaos. Holy smokes, that is a busy morning. So hopefully you got through some of that and you were able to start making some of those associations and follow along with, one species that's going at a time. And that's sort of the strategy, if you're going out and it's your first few times in some of those really chaotic environments, just try to focus on one species and then try to, catch wherever that species is calling from and keep track of it, and then practice putting that sound aside and trying to listen for other things that might be going on that might be a little bit, hard to hear because those other ones are calling all around you. And most often this is the blackbirds, but um, in some of these settings, it is definitely the wrens, where the wrens are just going nonstop in them. And I've got some of the videos that I managed to put up and put together. I do have a few more online, and some of them are based on some of those recordings that we just listened. But it's definitely something that I plan to do a bit more of this fall. I'm also going to do some grassland soundscapes, so I'll also keep you folks in the loop for that. So let's give a listen. I think I've got two of them queued up here. It's not terribly loud. So in that track, even, where I've just focused on the wetland species, but in a lot of cases, some of these wetlands, they aren't that big, and there's adjacent habitat near them. And one of the calls that really stands out is some of that bzz, 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 and that's the clay-colored sparrow, which is very, very common out west here. And, it's the sort of thing where if you have a shrub, you are very likely to have a clay-colored sparrow in it. And it's one that, we don't cover in a program like this because we're focused on the wetland birds. But for, doing a soundscape like this, it's hard to get just the purely wetland associated species, just because that habitat is all around them. Okay, this is the next one here, I believe. So I'm realizing in this one that it's not coming through super loudly on here, and sometimes it's hard to predict which ones which ones seem to be loud enough and which ones don't. Okay, that's it for the soundscapes. There are some more online, and if you do want to listen to them and you have a pair of over-the-ear headphones, that's really the best way to do it. My dinky little headphones that I wind up using because they have the microphone on them, they don't always, I can't always hear everything on a recording. So if you do have a good set of headphones or maybe a really good stereo surround sound, feel free to go to YouTube and give a listen to some of those other soundscapes. And I'm going to invite you to go out and make a wetland checklist anywhere, anytime this summer. If you haven't already registered, you can register for MarshWatch on our Nature Counts platform. You can either get the app or download the data sheet that's on the MarshWatch website. And the printed data sheet actually has some helpful hints on the back of it. So maybe you might just want to print it off just in case. Even if you don't plan on using it, there is some useful information on there. And then go out and observe. And even if you're not super confident, maybe you go, gosh, Leanne, I really only got the handle of a few species this year. You can still, get out there and practice collecting data. You just say, nope, this isn't a complete checklist of all of the species I heard, and you can just report what you were comfortable recording. Even going through the act of doing something like that helps to make it a little bit less scary if you've never done that sort of thing before. So get out, identify and count the birds, note the amphibians, mark down those helpful, amphibian codes. Those are also on the printed data sheet. So, and if you do that through the app, you can just submit your data right away. And this is the kind of thing that I like, being able to enter my observations and just hit the button, not have to go back to my computer. It just means I submit way more checklists than I ever did when it was just, okay, going through the backlog of my notebook and where on earth was this spot again. It's really nice to be able to have the app. But if you don't have the app or you're not an app kind of person, you can always go on the website and submit through Nature Counts that way. And 2026, by the numbers, we have had a lot of people register for this program. We had 266 registrations, and at least 173 people tuned in at least once. I know there's people that register for the program, but they never actually make it to a live webinar, and they're on there so they can get the links to the recordings. And there's some people who have been registering. Somebody registered even just yesterday. So it's pretty amazing that there's this many people that have tuned in at least once. Usually, if you're getting to that kind of 50%, you're pretty stoked about this, and this is more than 50%. So I'm really excited that, we had another successful year of MarshWatch. We had a little bit fewer registrations this year, and I suspect some of it is because I know some people emailed and said, hey, there's a Great Lakes MarshWatch being offered this year. I'm going to go tune into that one. And, I don't look at that as any sort of negative thing at all. I'm just super happy that it's expanding to other regions and people are taking advantage of it. So it is a little bit lower than last year, but I am not taking that as any sort of signal or anything. I'm quite stoked about it. Most people were tuning in from Canada, but almost 90% of you are from Canada, but we do have good representation throughout the States as well. And some people didn't let me know where they were tuning in from, and that's okay. You don't have to. It just gives us an idea. Breaking it down in Canada by province, this is, for the prairie provinces. And I'm seeing that we've got way more people in Alberta tuning in this year. So I'm going to see about trying to get out to do a wetland walk somewhere in Alberta this year. I'll have to see if we have it in the budget because I would really like to go. I have never been to Franks Lake, so if we can do a little trip to Franks Lake, I think that would be super exciting. Just because I see all of the really lovely photos on there, and it's just like, oh man, this looks like an amazing place. So, stay tuned. I haven't sorted out all the walks. It's just been a really busy field season this year. We have a new or a new program biologist, and I'm just doing a little bit more this season in some of the lead up for some of the things than I normally am. So I'm not quite as prepared for all of the walks, but I plan on doing some. And the other part of that is, my knee isn't quite there. I went to the grocery store for the first time. On Monday, and yeah, it doesn't take very much for my knee to get fatigued yet. So I'm going to be loading more of those marsh walks, I think, later into June and July. It's maybe less ideal for birds, but it's more manageable for me and my knee to be able to, do the travel to the places and then actually do the walks around those places. So I'm almost, getting back to normal, but I still have some limitations on the old knee there. But really good representation across Canada, and we have had a whole pile of people tuning in. I just took a peek here, and there are 62 of you in the audience this evening. And for a final review webinar for a wrap-up thing, like I think that's still pretty amazing that people would be willing to still tune in. You often see this, and I've seen it every year, kind of like there's people that tune in a lot in the earlier ones, and then it kind of trails off, and that kind of goes with the season. And I don't ever expect that anybody's going to be able to make it to all 10 webinars. That's a lot of time. I'm realizing. So I don't I, I don't judge. It's like, oh, Bob wasn't here on Tuesday. It's like, no, no, no. I know part of what we do is we record it, we make it available for people to you know, take a look at their own pace if they want to. And I'm amazed at, the retention throughout the webinars as it's gone by. I'm always amazed that enough people are tuning in and staying tuned in. So, I mean, thank you guys so much for continuing to come back. It makes a strong case for being able to deliver this programming and to continue to seek funding for something like this. And I love doing it. So as I was just alluding to for the marsh walks, stay tuned. I'm just behind in a few things, so I will be updating the website. And once I have a few more of those things nailed down, I'll be sending out an email as well to everyone who was registered. I did have a little bit of information for some of the walks in the last email I sent out. And if you want to come to that nighttime rail one, that should be fun. And we'll see how well it is. And I might think to run something like that again, in part because that would be, it's still reasonably local for me. It's about an hour's drive away. So that one will be a nighttime adventure. It'll be on a Friday night, but you have to be comfortable with driving in the dark. So just if you're not comfortable doing that, I mean, you could come and be a passenger. We're, happy to, well, for something like this, we meet at a location and then we carpool kind of on the fly. And if you don't want to do that, that you don't have to, but we usually try to limit the amount of vehicles going. So, maybe you're not comfortable driving at night out in the country, but you can hop in with someone who is that you trust. I don't want to force anybody into, a stranger's vehicle, essentially. But yeah, if you're interested in those walks, stay tuned. I will be posting more information. And like I said, hopefully my knee is going to be cooperative fairly soon. So it is a long rehab process when you wreck your ACL and blow your knee out completely. I don't recommend doing it. I'm also going to send out a feedback survey, and I'll probably get through that and get it out sometime next week. And yeah, it's obviously a voluntary feedback survey, but I do take into account the feedback that I get from it to help develop. We're getting closer and closer to MarshWatch. Really hasn't been changing very much between this year and last year. Every year I make a little bit more tweaks, but I think we're kind of landed on the format and the delivery that seems to work well. So I don't anticipate this changing too much in the future. But that doesn't mean that I wouldn't take your feedback into account. And I also solicit testimonials, and the testimonials are something that, I'm saying like, hey, please give, if you feel like leaving a review, leave a review. And this is the kind of thing that we share with funders. Funders really love to hear this stuff. It helps when we're advertising our programs, like, don't take our word for it. Take Stacy's word for it, or something like that. That kind of stuff goes a long way. And I just wanna note, I was able to take a peek at all of the post survey feedbacks, and you guys are very kind. There's been some lovely feedback in there, so thank you very much. So overall, thank you so much for taking this wetland journey with me. It's hard to believe that the 10 weeks are over already, but it's a little bit bittersweet. In part, the sweet part of it is because I know it's ending, and that's because the bird season is just about to get going. So I, I love doing these on the Wednesdays, but it's also nice that, okay, it ends at a time where you're like, yes, and now let's go take a look at the birds. So I'm excited for it. I hope you're excited for the upcoming season because there's all kinds of wonderment to be had out in the world wherever you're at. The thing with birds that's amazing is that almost everywhere has some birds. You could be in the middle of the city and you're still going to have some pigeons or some house sparrows, kind of eking out a living. Birds really are one of the, wildlife experiences that touch the most people. Almost everybody has some sort of a bird story at some point in their life. It's not everybody that has a deer story or, a frog story, but most people will have some sort of a bird story. So thanks for taking this journey with me. It is coming to an end for this year, but we will have some walks. And I hope to see a bunch of you back again next year if you feel like you're still getting something out of this. If not, don't worry. I don't expect people to attend for 5 years in a row. But you're absolutely welcome to do so if you want. Just want to give a huge shout out to my colleagues. So the program itself was developed by myself and Kyle Drake here in Saskatoon, with input from some of our wonderful colleagues. That includes Doug Tozer and Kathy Jones, who are delivering the Great Lakes version of the program, Amy Lee Goenberg, who's in the Maritimes, and other folks who've been helping to deliver that, Andrew Coughlin in Quebec, and David Bradley in BC. And a special thanks to all of the photographers over the years who have let me use their fabulous bird photos, because it is an art to, take these bird photos, and it's a lot of time, it's a lot of gear, it's a lot of experience. And so I'm immensely grateful for, all of the people who have said, yeah, go ahead, grab my photos from eBird, use them as you see fit. And, even the folks on iNaturalist, you know, what I love about iNaturalist is that you can, as you're, signing up, you can set the permissions for your photos. So a huge thank you to everybody who, sets those Creative Commons licenses and allows someone like me to quickly go, oh gosh, I really need a hooded merganser photo. Want them displaying, and I can just sort through on iNaturalist, and you can even sort by photo permissions. I think I'm just gonna have to make a donation to iNaturalist for how much I use the platform for, making photos or making slides like these. So thanks to all the photographers. It, the, Something like this wouldn't be the same without all of the amazing photos that people take. So if you want to reach out, my contact information is latremoy at Birds Canada. Sadly, they wouldn't let me have Bird Lady. A joke. I didn't actually ask about getting Bird Lady. The MarshWatch website is there. You can follow Birds Canada on all of the socials. We are a national not-for-profit, so if it is in your financial means to, give to not-for-profits, I hope you'll consider us in your charitable giving. A huge shout out to the supporters of MarshWatch. That's the Manitoba Habitat Conservancy, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment, Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, SaskPower, and Wildlife Habitat Canada.